I never thought I'd be the kind of man who would track his wife's every move for years. Never imagined I'd spend my evenings creating spreadsheets, documenting another person's betrayal. Never believed I'd become this version of myself. But that's what happens when you discover the person sleeping beside you for 15 years is essentially a stranger. 7 years. That's how long Rebecca lived her double life, while I maintained the ledger of her deception. 7 years of her thinking she was so clever, so careful, while I documented every lie, every unexplained expense, every mysterious disappearance. When she finally asked for a divorce last month, demanding half of everything we'd built together, she had no idea what was coming. How could she? She thought I was the same trusting fool she'd married the reliable accountant who was too boring to question her elaborate web of lies. The judge's face when I presented my evidence? Priceless. Rebecca's expression when she realized she wasn't walking away with a dime, but rather drowning in debt? Even better. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began. The moment I realized my wife wasn't just having an affair, she was living an entirely different life. It started with a receipt. Such a small thing, really. A crumpled piece of paper I found while doing laundry. A dinner for two at Castellano's, an expensive Italian restaurant downtown. The problem? Rebecca had told me she was having dinner with her sister that night, at a casual bistro across town. When I texted her sister later to thank her for spending time with Rebecca, she seemed confused. "I haven't seen Rebecca in weeks," she wrote back. That single receipt was like pulling a loose thread on a sweater. Once I started tugging, everything began to unravel. And what I found underneath wasn't just infidelity, it was something far more calculated, far more deliberate. I didn't confront her immediately. Something inside me shifted. The accountant in me took over. If there was one discrepancy, there had to be others, and I was going to find them all. That night, as Rebecca slept soundly beside me, I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. I would become the auditor of her deception. I would build a case so thorough, so meticulous, that when the moment came, there would be no escape. Little did I know how deep the rabbit hole would go. I've always been good with numbers. It's why I became an accountant in the first place. There's a comforting certainty in the way numbers add up. They don't lie. They don't deceive. They simply are what they are. If only people were as reliable. The day after finding that receipt, I started my investigation. I told myself it was just to confirm my suspicions about an affair. Nothing more. I created a new email account and requested our credit card statements going back 3 years. Rebecca and I had always maintained joint accounts, another sign of our supposed trust in each other. I almost laughed at the irony as I downloaded the statements. Then I pulled our cell phone records, our bank statements, every financial document I could legally access. I converted our spare bedroom into what essentially became a command center for Operation Truth, as I privately called it. I installed a bulletin board on the wall, color-coded pushpins, red string connecting events, the whole detective movie cliché. If Rebecca ever wondered why I suddenly started working late in that room, she never asked. Probably grateful for the time it gave her to conduct her other life. The patterns emerged quickly. Every second Tuesday, charges at hotels under our joint credit card, always explained away as girls' night or work events. The same restaurant appearing multiple times, always when she claimed to be somewhere else. Small cash withdrawals, systematically, that added up to thousands over time. But the true discovery came when I found a second phone bill, one I knew nothing about. Rebecca had a separate line, a separate identity. I had to call in a favor from an old client who worked at the phone company to get access to those records. What I found confirmed my worst fears: constant communication with a number I didn't recognize. Texts and calls at all hours, including times when she was supposedly asleep beside me. I remember sitting in that spare bedroom, surrounded by paper trails of deception, and feeling something inside me crack. Our anniversary dinner 2 months earlier flashed through my mind. Rebecca smiling across the table, raising her glass. To us, Michael, to 15 amazing years and many more to come. All while she was living this shadow life. I decided then to go deeper. This wasn't just about catching her in an affair anymore. This was about understanding the full scope of her betrayal. How long had it been going on? How many others were there? And most importantly, what else was she hiding? I hired a private investigator paid in cash, of course. Nothing that could be traced back to our joint accounts. Rebecca had taught me the value of discretion, after all. The PI confirmed what I already suspected: regular meetings with a man named David Lancaster, executive at a competing firm, married with 2 kids, just like us. Except Rebecca and I could never have children. Another wound that this betrayal reopened. But there was more. So much more than I had anticipated. The PI's report showed Rebecca entering various properties across the city. Properties I knew nothing about. One afternoon, while she was supposedly at a company retreat, I followed her myself. She entered a modest townhouse in the suburbs, using her own key. Through the window, I could see her moving comfortably around the space like she belonged there. She did belong there, as it turned out, because Rebecca wasn't just having an affair. She had purchased property. She had invested in businesses. She had opened accounts under names I didn't recognize. My wife wasn't just sleeping with someone else. She had created an entire parallel financial existence. The question was, where was the money coming from? The further I dug, the more complex Rebecca's web became. This wasn't just about infidelity. This was about financial deception on a scale I couldn't have imagined. The townhouse I discovered was just the beginning. Through careful tracking and some creative investigation, I uncovered 3 separate properties purchased under an LLC registered to R. Winters, my wife's maiden name. Where was this money coming from? Rebecca earned a good salary as a marketing executive, but nothing that could support this kind of lifestyle. Something didn't add up, and if there's one thing that drives an accountant crazy, it's when the numbers don't add up. I began correlating her business trips with unexplained deposits into accounts I'd discovered. The patterns were undeniable. Every trip to Chicago resulted in a $5,000 deposit. New York, $7,500. Los Angeles, always $10,000. These weren't random numbers. This was systematic. One night after Rebecca had gone to sleep, I carefully went through her home office. Behind a false panel in her desk drawer, seriously? Who has those in real life? I found a second passport. Same photo, different name. Next to it, business cards for Rachel Winters, investment consultant, a separate phone, and a small notebook with what appeared to be client names and amounts. I sat on the floor of her office. These items spread before me, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who was this woman? The person I'd shared my bed with for 15 years was a complete stranger. I felt the urge to wake her up, to confront her then and there, but the accountant in me held back. The evidence was substantial, but still incomplete. I needed to understand the full scope of her operation before making my move. The next day, I called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. As soon as Rebecca left for her office, I began a systematic search of our home. In the back of our shared closet, behind my old tax returns that she knew I never touched, I found a locked briefcase. The combination? Our wedding date, almost insulting in its predictability. Inside was a laptop I'd never seen before. Password protected, of course, but Rebecca had always used the same password structure for everything: our dog's name plus the year we met. 3 attempts later, I was in. What I found turned my blood cold. Emails, spreadsheets, documents, all pointing to something far darker than I'd imagined. Rebecca wasn't just having an affair and hiding money. She was running what appeared to be an investment scheme across multiple states, collecting money from clients, many of whom appeared to be vulnerable women going through divorces or recent widows with promises of exclusive investment opportunities. There were spreadsheets tracking clients, investment amounts, and returns, except the returns column was largely empty. This wasn't just infidelity or financial independence for me. This was fraud, criminal fraud, and I felt sick as I dug deeper. These weren't wealthy investors who could absorb losses. These were people like my mother after my father died, vulnerable, trusting, and desperate for financial security. One email exchange particularly haunted me, a woman begging for her money back to pay for her daughter's cancer treatment. Rebecca's response was coldly professional. explaining that investments were locked in for the full term and early withdrawal wasn't possible. My hands were shaking as I carefully replaced everything exactly as I'd found it. I copied key files onto a flash drive, then cleared my digital tracks. As I locked the briefcase and returned it to its hiding place, I realized I was now complicit in a way. I knew about potentially criminal activity and was saying nothing. But I also knew I needed more evidence, more understanding of how deep this went. I needed to build not just a divorce case, but potentially something that would stand up in criminal court. That night, as Rebecca and I ate dinner together, she chatting about her normal workday while I nodded and smiled, I realized that our entire marriage had been built on a foundation of lies. And I wondered if she had ever loved me at all, or if I had simply been the perfect cover for her schemes all along. The reliable, trusting accountant husband. The perfect facade for a woman leading a double life. 6 months into my investigation, I had amassed enough evidence to bury Rebecca both in divorce court and possibly in criminal proceedings. I had documented over $1.2 million in fraudulent investments, identified more than 30 victims across 12 states, mapped out her complex network of shell companies and hidden accounts. I had become an expert in my wife's criminal enterprise. And yet I still hadn't confronted her. Something held me back. Perhaps it was the sheer disbelief that the woman I had loved for so long could be capable of such calculated deception. Or maybe it was simple self-preservation. The moment I revealed what I knew, everything would change irrevocably. That decision was made for me on a rainy Tuesday in October. I came home early from work with a migraine. As I pulled into our driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street. Dark sedan, tinted windows. Something about it seemed official. I entered quietly through the garage, planning to head straight upstairs for medication and darkness. But voices from the living room stopped me. Rebecca's, tense and hushed, and a man's I didn't recognize. They're asking questions, David. Specific questions. About the Chicago accounts. You're being paranoid. The man, presumably David, her lover, responded. We've been careful. Everything's routed through the offshore accounts. The Winslow woman filed a complaint. She's claiming fraud. She has no proof. And even if she did, there's nothing that leads back to you personally. That's why we set up the structures the way we did. I stood frozen in the hallway, recording their conversation on my phone. This wasn't just confirmation of what I already knew. This was Rebecca actively discussing how to continue evading detection. What about Michael? David asked, his voice lowering. Does he suspect anything? Rebecca's laugh was like ice water down my spine. Michael? God, no. He sees what he wants to see. Trust me, he's still the same oblivious accountant, happy in his little world of tax codes and spreadsheets. He'd never have the imagination to figure this out. The contempt in her voice hit me like a physical blow. 7 years of deception, and this was what she truly thought of me. Oblivious, unimaginative, a convenient fool. We should still accelerate the timeline, David continued. File for divorce sooner rather than later. Get your half before anything comes to light. I've already contacted a lawyer, Rebecca replied. I'm meeting with him tomorrow. I'll file next week, cite irreconcilable differences. Michael won't contest it. He'll be too shocked, too desperate to understand why. By the time the dust settles, the assets will be transferred and we'll be in the clear. I backed away silently, returned to my car, and drove to a coffee shop where I sat for hours, the conversation replaying in my mind. Rebecca wasn't just planning to leave me, she was planning to use our divorce as the final act in her elaborate fraud. Take half of our legitimate assets, combine them with her ill-gotten gains, and disappear with her partner in crime. The migraine was forgotten. In its place, a clarity I hadn't felt in months. It was time to stop collecting evidence and start using it, but not in the way I had originally planned. Rebecca wanted a divorce? Fine, I would give her exactly what she wanted, but on my terms, not hers. I pulled out my phone and made a call to an old college friend who had become a federal prosecutor. Jim, it's Michael. I need to meet with you. Tonight. It's complicated. As I drove to meet him, carrying the flash drive with copies of everything I discovered, I felt a strange sense of calm. The endless nights of investigation, the pain of betrayal, the shock of discovery, all of it had led to this moment. Rebecca thought I was predictable, uncreative, easily manipulated. She was about to discover just how wrong she'd been. Jim's face grew increasingly grave as I laid out my evidence in his living room that night. Spreadsheets, bank statements, recordings, photographs, 7 years of meticulous documentation spread across his coffee table. "Jesus, Michael," he said finally, running a hand through his thinning hair. "This is comprehensive. How long have you been tracking all this?" "Since I found out about the affair. 7 years. He shook his head, a mixture of admiration and concern in his eyes. "And you never confronted her? Never let on that you knew?" I wanted the complete picture first. I gestured to the papers between us. This wasn't just about her sleeping with someone else. This was organized fraud, and I needed to understand how deep it went. Jim nodded slowly, examining a particularly damning document detailing transfers to offshore accounts. "This is enough to open an investigation. Multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, possibly money laundering. But Michael, you know where this leads, right? If we move forward with this, Rebecca's going to prison." "For years." I sat back, feeling the weight of that statement. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and lies, there had been 15 years of history between us. Memories. A life built together, even if part of it had been an elaborate facade. "I understand," I said finally, "but there are victims here. People who lost their life savings. People who trusted her." And Jim nodded. "So what's your plan? Because if she files for divorce next week like you overheard, we won't have an investigation in place by then. She could still walk away with half your legitimate assets." I allowed myself a small smile. "That's where you're wrong. Rebecca made one critical mistake in her calculations." "What's that?" "She married an accountant, one who's been preparing for this day for 7 years. The plan I outlined to Jim was complex but bulletproof. While Rebecca had been building her fraudulent empire, I had been quietly restructuring our legitimate finances, creating trusts, moving assets, establishing paper trails that protected our joint holdings from her criminal activities. I wasn't hiding money. Everything was documented, legal, and transparent. I had simply been ensuring that when the time came, innocent entities wouldn't be dragged down with her guilty ones. "I need 2 things from you," I told Jim. "First, I need you to hold off on any official investigation until after she files for divorce. Let her make the first move. And second, I need you to help me coordinate with the divorce court. When she files, I want to be ready with my response." Jim studied me for a long moment. "You know, most people in your situation would have confronted her years ago, had a blow-up, messy divorce, moved on with their lives. Why the long game?" I thought about that question as I drove home that night. Why had I waited? Why had I spent 7 years documenting her betrayal instead of simply ending things at the first sign of infidelity? The answer came to me as I pulled into our driveway, looking at the house we'd shared for so long. Because Rebecca hadn't just cheated on me. She hadn't just lied to me. She had constructed an entire parallel life, one that victimized innocent people. And she had used our marriage, used me as the respectable cover for her operation. I deserved more than just freedom from a cheating spouse. I deserved justice. And so did everyone else she had betrayed. That night I slept in the guest room, claiming my migraine had worsened. As I lay awake listening to the sounds of our home, I realized it was the first night in 7 years that I wasn't pretending. Tomorrow, Rebecca would meet with her lawyer. Next week, she would file for divorce. And I would be ready. When the divorce papers arrived, I accepted them with such calm that the server seemed almost disappointed. No drama, no emotional outburst. Just a simple nod and signature acknowledging receipt. Rebecca had moved out 3 days earlier, claiming she needed space to find herself. I had helped her pack, playing the role of the confused, heartbroken husband one last time. Little did she know that her departure had freed me to accelerate my own preparations. The moment she was gone, I contacted my team, the private investigator, my attorney Jim, and the forensic accountant I'd hired 6 months earlier. Everything was in place. Rebecca's divorce filing was exactly as I'd expected, claiming irreconcilable differences, requesting an equitable distribution of assets, alimony based on maintaining her current lifestyle, standard language masking her true intentions. She wanted half of everything, plus ongoing support, while she quietly transferred her fraudulent gains overseas. My counterfiling, however, was anything but standard. 2 days later, I sat across from Rebecca and her attorney in our first mediation session. She looked confident, almost smug, as her lawyer outlined their generous terms. I would keep the house, which was underwater after she had secretly remortgaged it, my retirement accounts, which she had already duplicated and drained, and my business interests. She would take our liquid assets, investment portfolios, and receive ongoing alimony. When they finished, my attorney, a razor-sharp litigator named Sarah who specialized in high-net-worth divorces involving fraud, smiled pleasantly. "Before we respond to your proposal," she said, sliding a thick folder across the table, "I think you should review these documents." Rebecca's attorney frowned, opening the folder. "What is this?" "That," I said, speaking for the first time, "is a complete accounting of your client's activities over the past 7 years. Financial statements, phone records, property deeds, offshore accounts, and evidence of approximately $1.2 million in investment fraud across 12 states. The color drained from Rebecca's face. "What are you talking about?" But her voice lacked conviction. I leaned forward. "You know exactly what I'm talking about, Rebecca. Or should I call you Rachel Winters? I particularly like the investment portfolio you created for Mrs. Hernandez, the widow with 3 young children, the one who lost her husband's entire life insurance payout in your exclusive investment opportunity." Her lawyer was frantically flipping through the documents, his expression growing more alarmed with each page. "Miss Taylor, is there something you haven't disclosed to me?" Rebecca's eyes never left mine. "This is ridiculous. Michael is clearly manufacturing evidence because he's bitter about our marriage ending." I smiled sadly. "That would be a convenient explanation. Unfortunately for you, everything in that folder has been verified by a forensic accountant and the federal prosecutor who's currently building a case against you." Her lawyer stood abruptly. "I need to speak with my client privately." "Of course," Sarah replied smoothly. "While you do that, you might want to explain to her that if she proceeds with her current divorce filing, all of this evidence will become part of the public record. Alternatively," she slid a second, thinner folder across the table. "These are our terms." As Rebecca and her lawyer left the room, I caught a glimpse of something I'd never seen on my wife's face before. Fear. Real, genuine fear. The mask of confidence had cracked, revealing the panic underneath. When they returned 30 minutes later, Rebecca wouldn't meet my eyes. Her lawyer, looking grave, addressed Sarah rather than me. "We need time to review your proposal properly." Sarah shook her head. "The offer expires at the end of this meeting. Your client can either accept our terms now, or we proceed to court with all evidence submitted to the public record." The implications hung in the air. Court meant public exposure. Public exposure meant criminal investigation. Criminal investigation meant prison. Rebecca finally looked up, her eyes cold. "You've been planning this for years, haven't you? All this time I thought you were oblivious, but you were, what, building a case against me?" "I prefer to think of it as maintaining accurate records," I replied. "You know how detail-oriented accountants can be." In the end, she signed, not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. The terms were clear. She would renounce all claims to our joint assets. She would acknowledge her debts and financial misdeeds in a sealed document. She would make restitution to her victims over time. In exchange, I would not proactively submit my evidence to prosecutors. Of course, what Rebecca didn't know was that Jim already had copies of everything. Her agreement to my terms had simply bought her time to begin making restitution before the criminal charges inevitably came. As we left the mediation room, Rebecca caught my arm. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why go through all this? Why not just divorce me years ago when you first found out?" I studied her face, this woman I had loved, this stranger I had lived with for 15 years. Because you didn't just betray me, Rebecca. You betrayed everyone who trusted you, and some things are worth taking the time to get right. I gently removed her hand from my arm and walked away, leaving behind the ledger of lies that had defined our marriage for so long. The next few months unfolded with the precision of a well-maintained accounting system. First came the divorce settlement, finalized quickly, with Rebecca accepting terms that left her with nothing from our marriage except her personal belongings and the debt associated with her fraudulent activities. Then came the quiet notifications to her victims. My team had identified 37 individuals who had lost money in Rebecca's schemes. Working with Jim, we established a restitution process, one that would return at least some of their investments before any criminal proceedings complicated matters. Rebecca, to her credit, or perhaps to avoid prosecution, began liquidating her hidden assets. The townhouse went on the market. The luxury car was sold. The offshore accounts were slowly emptied and funds transferred to an escrow account managed by the court. I maintained my distance through all of this, communicating only through attorneys, until the day I received a text from an unknown number. "Coffee, I owe you at least a conversation." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet Rebecca at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown, far from our old neighborhood. When I arrived, I almost didn't recognize her. Gone was the polished executive in designer clothes. In her place sat a woman in simple jeans and a sweater, hair pulled back, minimal makeup. She looked authentic, ironic given the circumstances. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I admitted. An uncomfortable silence stretched between us. 15 years of marriage, and now we had nothing to say to each other. Finally, she spoke. "I've been seeing someone, a therapist, I mean, trying to understand why I did what I did." I nodded but offered no response. "The fraud started small," she continued. "Just a favor for David, helping him raise money for what I thought was a legitimate investment. But then you discovered how easy it was," I finished for her. "How convincing you could be. How much money you could make." She looked down at her untouched coffee. "Yes, and then it became addictive. The secret life, the power of it. I told myself the investors would get their money back eventually, that no one was really getting hurt. Except they were." My voice was flat. "People lost their homes, Rebecca, their retirement savings, money for medical treatments." "I know." Two simple words, heavy with acknowledgement. "I'm making it right, as much as I can." "Because you got caught." "Yes," she admitted. "Initially, yes. But now, I need to do this regardless. For myself. For them." I studied her, trying to see past the facade I'd known for so long, searching for any glimpse of the woman I thought I had married. "Are you going to turn yourself in? Save the prosecutors the trouble of building the case?" She looked up, surprise in her eyes. "You mean they're not already—" I shook my head. "Jim was waiting, giving you a chance to make restitution first." "Why would he do that? Why would you do that?" I considered the question carefully. Why had I insisted on this approach? Why give her any opportunity to make things right? "Because punishment without rehabilitation is just revenge," I said finally, "and I didn't want this to be about revenge. I wanted justice for me, for the people you hurt, but also closure for everyone." Rebecca wiped away a tear. "I don't deserve your consideration." "Probably not," I agreed. "But it wasn't just for you. It was for me too. I needed to end this the right way, to be someone I could still respect in the mirror." She nodded slowly. "To answer your question, yes, I'm meeting with the federal prosecutor tomorrow. Voluntary surrender, full confession. My lawyer says with cooperation and the restitution already in progress, I might get 5 years instead of 15. "Good," I said, surprised to find I meant it. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because it meant this chapter could finally close. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Rebecca." As I stood to leave, she caught my hand. "You know the strangest part of all this? Despite everything, the affairs, the fraud, the lies, there were moments, many moments, when I genuinely loved you. When our life together was real. I know you won't believe that, but it's true. I gently removed my hand from hers. The problem is, Rebecca, I have no way of knowing which moments those were. Walking away from that coffee shop, I felt an unexpected lightness. For 7 years, I had been the accountant of her deception, tracking every lie, every betrayal. Now, finally, the books were balanced, the audit complete. It was time to close the ledger. 1 year later, I sat in my newly renovated home office, reviewing the final paperwork. The last of Rebecca's victims had received their restitution payments. The court-appointed trustee had submitted the final accounting of her assets, and my own financial life had been completely restructured, scrubbed clean of the tangled web she had created. Rebecca herself was 8 months into a 4-year sentence at a minimum security federal prison. She wrote to me occasionally letters I read but rarely responded to. Each one contained pieces of explanation, apology, reflection. The therapist she was seeing inside was apparently helping her understand the pathology behind her deceptions. I didn't need her explanations. I had made my peace with our history. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my thoughts. Downstairs, I found Sarah, my former divorce attorney, now something more waiting with a bottle of champagne. "Ready to celebrate?" she asked with a smile. I nodded, taking the bottle. "The final paperwork came through this morning. It's officially done." She followed me to the kitchen, where I opened the champagne and poured 2 glasses. "To closing chapters," she toasted. "And to honest beginnings," I added. We had started dating 6 months after my divorce was finalized. Sarah had seen me at my lowest point, had witnessed the systematic dismantling of my marriage, and yet had recognized something in me worth pursuing. Something beyond the betrayed husband, beyond the meticulous accountant who had documented his wife's double life. Later that evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Sarah asked the question I knew had been on her mind. "Do you ever regret it? Not confronting her sooner? Spending all those years essentially living a double life yourself, tracking her deceptions, without letting on that you knew?" I considered the question carefully. I used to think I did it for justice, to build an airtight case, but lately I've been wondering if there was more to it. Like what? Like maybe I was afraid, not just of confronting her, but of what would come after, of having to rebuild everything from scratch. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. And now? Now I realize that sometimes things need to be completely dismantled before they can be rebuilt properly. Those 7 years weren't just about documenting Rebecca's betrayal. They were about me figuring out who I was apart from her lies, learning to trust my instincts again. I took Sarah's hand, grateful for her presence, for the straightforward honesty of our relationship. If I had confronted Rebecca at the first sign of her affair, I might never have uncovered the full extent of her fraud. Those victims might never have seen justice or restitution, and I might have spent years questioning what was real and what wasn't. "So no regrets then?" she asked. I smiled, watching the last rays of sunlight filter through the trees. "Just one, that I wasted so many years living in the shadow of someone else's deception instead of building something authentic from the start." Sarah squeezed my hand. "Some lessons have to be learned the hard way." True. But you know what the strangest part is? In a weird way, I'm grateful for those years, for maintaining that ledger of lies. It taught me the value of truth, the importance of transparency, lessons I might never have learned otherwise. As darkness fell around us, I thought about the files still stored in my home safe. 7 years of documentation, a complete accounting of betrayal. I kept them not as a reminder of what I had lost, but as evidence of what I had survived. Rebecca had lived her double life for 7 years, while I had kept the books. In the end, her elaborate fraud had collapsed under the weight of simple accounting. Numbers don't lie, even when people do. I had once defined myself as the victim of her deception. Now I saw myself as the architect of my own redemption, the betrayed spouse who had become the master of his own narrative, the accountant who had balanced not just the books, but the scales of justice. And now, finally, I was ready to close the ledger and start a new account. One built on honesty, transparency, and trust. One where the numbers would always add up. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Have you ever discovered a secret that changed everything? Share your experiences in the comments below.